My name is Kijana Woodard. Let's turn on this. There we go. A little bit about me. I've been a developer since 1996, programming in .NET since 1.0. Pretty active on the Raven forums. I'm also active on a couple other forums like DDD, CQRS forum, and the In-Service Bus forum. I'm also in In-Service Bus Gold support, so if you have a problem with In-Service Bus, I might be answering the phone, although it rarely happens. Also, I'm a husband and I have 2 kids, 2 boys, 2 and 3, so that's me. When the topic for, Oren asked if anybody wanted to give a speech, like this was the first thing that popped in my head was abstracting RavenDB, don't do it. It comes up on the forum fairly often where somebody will say, I have a problem with RavenDB. Okay, show us your code. And then they show the code, and there's not an ounce of RavenDB anywhere in the code post. It's like, what is this? And they've built this abstraction layer over the top of RavenDB, and they're saying they have a problem. And I find this is actually true with pretty much every technology, and I don't know exactly what it is, but it's some sort of sickness, right? And I can recognize the sickness because I have the sickness myself. Like, I am guilty of over-engineering projects or prematurely abstracting. And I see customers and clients all the time who will get a new technology and the first thing they do is build an abstraction layer. It's like they don't even know how to use it, but let's build an abstraction layer. The other day on the forum, Khalid said something like, I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but don't abstract like this. Well, I feel like the subtitle of this talk really should be, don't do it. Like really, it's just stop. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to try to, really just destroy the whole idea of this guy. So, I feel at this point the tide has turned against it, but it still lives out there, especially in big companies. People have this idea that, if I just write this generic repository, all our problems are done, right? So as the architect, I'm going to sit back, I'm going to specify this guy, and then that's it, right? The juniors now can just go in and just fill out all the implementation details, and we're done, right? One other side note is the capital ID. I have no idea why ID has ever had 2 capital letters, and I hate it, and so hopefully this is the last slide that has it, but I copied this off the web and it had it. It's just a pet peeve. So, why do we want this repository pattern or this abstraction layer? One reason is we want to decouple our application logic from the data access logic. We also want the ability to swap out our persistence technology because, if we get in trouble, we can just change over. We want testability. We want maintainability. Right? Okay, so let's decouple the application logic from the data access. So what are we abstracting away, right? Here's some code from the Raven client document session, IDocumentSession. I've taken out a few of the overloads, but this is most of the stuff, right? We have store and save changes and load and query, okay? So that's the data access layer, right? So then we're going to replace that with this. Like, what did we replace, right? It's pretty much the same stuff. Like, delete is delete. Like, okay, add is now store. So like, I guess if you really just hate the word store, you want add, right? There you go. You've renamed it, right? So, maybe things are different, like with something like Entity Framework. Like here's DB set from Entity Framework, but it's kind of the same thing again, right? You have remove instead of delete. Oh, okay. But you also have some other things like SQL query, right? Like get out of jail free card, right? Just run some SQL. So what we've really done back here is just sort of truncate the API, right? We haven't really abstracted away complexity. We've just ignored it, right? So now we want to be able to swap out our persistence technology, right? Like so like I said, you get in trouble and you can just change over at will. But we've reduced our feature set to the lowest common denominator, right? So then, what are we going to do about these things, right? How do we do a facet search or spatial query or attachments? How do we do streaming? Or if we want to do like drop down to Lucene syntax, like Mauro was just pointing out, or I think it came up on the forum last week where somebody had a problem and, the answer was, use Lucene. How do we do that? Okay, so let's say we swap out and we're going to go to Redis, right? Like, how do we do the increment statement, decrement? We go to SQL Server, they have a concept of a hierarchy ID that I've used. I thought it was pretty cool. Where's that in our abstraction layer? Mongo MapReduce, like, oh, all right, fine, MapReduce. We have Mongo MapReduce and Raven MapReduce. We have two things we can put on an abstraction layer, but they're totally different. They work in a completely different ways. You can't just swap this out as if, everything's just going to work out, right? So we basically lost all the flexibility and the power to use the power of whatever technology choice we've made. We've chosen 7 persistence technology, and now we can't use it. So, abstracting this way is like, having a chef and telling him, like, we're going to abstract you away from a particular kitchen by not letting you touch the stove and the oven, right? Like, we have very smart people who have figured out, like, all the settings for the oven and the stove, and you just come in and do your cooking, right? So again, like, managers and architects kind of love this idea, right? Like, we'll get all the smart people in the room, and then the juniors can just go do the implementation. But if you have juniors that are any good, they're just not going to be happy just sort of filling in your curly braces with text, right? And if they're not any good, why do you have them around, right? And if you have a bunch of people who aren't any good that are around that can't learn stuff, then maybe the managers and the architects are the problem. But that's a different problem. So, let's say that we want to put a little flexibility in, like, surely we can do something so, like, we can add a little feature. So we want to add our Lucene feature to our repository, right? So then we have our SQL Server implementation of the repository, and we have a Lucene query, throw not implemented. And you see this kind of stuff all the time, but I thought the idea is that we could just swap out, our implementation. But in fact, we can't. And if we ever did, we have these little time bombs that are just going to go off, right? So, how fun would it be to be on the project 3 years from now, the swap out project, when the architect who put this in place is now, like, moved up, and he's already promised all the executives that swapping out the persistence is only going to take, a couple days. And now, if you can't do it, obviously you're not capable, right? You're just not good enough, right? It's not going to be a fun time. What if we don't even want to change the actual persistence? We just want to go to something like async, right? Everybody done MVC 5. We're all async now, await async. So we'll just add the async to the end of all the methods, put task of T as a return type, and done, right? Yeah, no. A couple of weeks ago, I'm working on a project and MySQL is involved, and I went, let's see where the async adapter is. Doesn't exist, and just wrapping everything in task.startNew is not gonna work out too well. So the thing here is really that changing the code is really the least of your worries when you're swapping out your persistence technology. Like, you've made a choice. Mauro was just talking about eventual consistency. Like, if you're going to move from a relational database with immediate consistency to something with eventual consistency, that's going to have a much bigger impact on your UI, which is going to have an impact on business processes, which is going to have an impact on user expectations. And that now enters the realm of a political problem, not a technical problem. All of that is going to be much harder than just, removing a reference to technology A, seeing where the project breaks, and then just doing find replaces and changing whatever technology A is get by ID to technology B get by ID. That's not that big of a deal. Interestingly, the hardest sort of swap out that I've ever done was swapping out from Entity Framework 1 to Entity Framework 4. Like, it was so dramatic of a shift, and Entity Framework 4 was a lot better. It was so dramatic of a shift that, like, pretty much the project just fell on the floor, and I had to sort of piece it back together. Another thing about this whole swappability thing is, like, what if we just want to swap one feature, right? Like, I just want to change the way search works. So in the SQL Server repository implementation, I go to the find method and make that go against RavenDB. Yeah, that's pretty weird. So, you know, you don't even really have the levers to pull to sort of change things out in a way other than a wholesale changeover. Testability. So the idea with the repository is that, oh, well, we'll create an in-memory representation of all the things for our unit tests of our data. Well, once we get all that working, we have now proven that our code will work against a persistence engine, which will never exist in production. Great.
If I can interrupt,
Yeah.
I was on a project that did exactly that. We had the second layer, we did the repository, and then we had it in memory. And the thinking was, if the database guys don't have all their stuff in line or ready for us, we can just run against in memory to test our stuff, right?
Right.
But in reality, it falls apart pretty quick. And worse, what really happens is because no one's running against in memory, like you said, it's not going to ever be in production.
Right.
Stuff gets neglected, and then pretty soon it's like, oh, in memory doesn't work anymore. We stopped implementing that. So
Right.
It really does fall apart.
It falls apart pretty quick. The other thing about this is, like, I'm not even sure this is really unit testing, but I'm going to hit on that a little bit later. For RavenDB, you don't even need this because you can just run an in-memory version of RavenDB. And now with 3.0, what we heard earlier, it's going to work even better. There were some edge cases where things wouldn't work the same with embedded and the full thing, but now that looks like it's going to be improved. So I actually forget how much I like this method of testing. So when I go to a project, and I went to one recently and it was SQL Server, and it's like, oh, they had no tests at all. So I was like, okay, I'm going to have get something working. Okay, I can't do in memory. Okay, so we need to create a script that will create the database in a known state, and we'll put that on the CI server, and then all the developers need to remember to keep that up to date with sort of the way the project is progressing. Like, okay, well, we'll use SQLite, right? Because that'll run in memory. But oh crap, like the scripts to build the database that we have don't actually work in SQLite. It's like, okay, well, look, I'm just gonna forge ahead and get something up on a server, and then I'm just gonna put the data that I need for the test into the database, and oh crap, I can't do that because all the foreign keys start failing, and then I just said, forget it. It's like, it was really painful. So I really like the Raven Test Helpers project. That's another thing that people kind of get beat up on the forum. I think you probably have like an auto hotkey, something to just say like, please, please give a test. I actually went and I kept forgetting the NuGet reference here, so because it's ravendb.tests.helpers, even though it's called RavenDB Test Helpers, and I kept forgetting it, and NuGet kept yelling at me, so I finally went and did a pull request to put the package manager instruction in there. It's only on the 2.5 version. I didn't go back to the older versions. But yeah, so I'm a contributor now. Let's see. Okay, so maintainability, right? So now we're on solid ground, right? This is going to be the where we really win, right? We can write our code in a consistent way. You know, all the large team can work against this, and we're going to reduce the number of bugs that we have, right? But what about this abstraction layer itself, right? right here in the code, in the slides that I've already shown you, we have this fine funct bool, right? So this actually comes up fairly often in my work where people will call me and go like, oh my God, RavenDB or MySQL Reddit, whatever, it sucks. And I can recognize this pretty quickly because I've made this mistake on that EF1 project. This actually works fairly well when you're using your in-memory data, and it works fairly well when you have very few records in your database. As soon as you start putting real data, it blows up because what you're really doing is just pulling everything back, right? So right now we have a bug in our abstraction, so we can fix it. Now this will actually do what we think it's going to do. Okay, great. So we've got that one out of the way, right? But this sort of thing is something that the business folks just hate, right? Like, because we promise them, like, don't worry, we've got all our smart guys working on this abstraction, and then no more bugs. And there's a bug in here. It doesn't add any actual value. As we saw, we're just translating from this to the real call, but there's a bug that we paid for. Another problem is that abstractions leak. As much as we try to sort of paper things over, they just keep surfacing, or I guess coming out of the ceiling. They just keep coming up, right? You can't keep them down. For instance, this get by ID, int ID. Why is it an int? Well, I guess, in relational databases, we used to put ints as the primary key because you can do an auto increment. But I mean, really, when you look at it from an object modeling perspective, like, why is it an int? Like, are we going to add them together? Nope. Okay, so, all right, we're going to swap out. We're going to swap out to event store because we're going to go event sourcing. Oh, wait, they want a GUID. Crap. Now we have 50 classes that we need to swap to GUIDs, but I thought this was going to save us. Like, okay, we're going to RavenDB. It's a string. Maybe we're going to write something right on Voron and we want to use a long, right? So like we're still just stuck, right? And I've seen this kind of thing even with like using GUIDs where you have two languages, right? So you have .NET and something else like Python or whatever. But Python demands that a GUID is a UUID colon thing, GUID with no hyphens, right? So now you have bugs because, oh crap, I forgot to do toString in this one spot. And then on the way back, I forgot to parse off the UUID colon. And it's just really a problem. Raven's really convinced me that strings are a better identifier. Matt Warren has a great post about structured document keys. That's something great to go read. I really like the way it kind of gives you sort of metadata about your document structure while letting each document itself provide a consistency boundary. So, what are we going to do here? Okay, we can put in T key, right? So now it can be whatever we need it to be, right? So I kind of typed this up on the slide and immediately like, oh man, should the T key go first or should it go second? I was getting this debate and I was like, oh, I could see an argument cropping up about what's the right way to do it, right? And of course then like ReSharper yells at me like, hey, this can be covariant, right? Great, right? So, okay, we have this add method, like what could be wrong with that, right? Well, how do we get the identifier back out? Well, in Raven, it's just going to be there on the document, assuming that we're not using the identity prefix that's going to give us an incrementing ID, because then it won't be there until we call save changes. But if you're using some other store that you swapped out to, how are you going to get it back? I don't know. Update. Okay, so we go to update, and there's a concurrency exception. Okay, we catch that. But now we're catching the Raven concurrency exception, so Raven just got right back into the client code that we didn't want it in. Delete, the same problem. Is this going to happen immediately, or is it going to wait? Is it going to be deferred until we save changes? If that's important, now we have to break our abstraction to kind of leak that information through. get all, like, right? Like this should be pretty good. Like at least if the implementer uses the streaming API, you can say get all and everything should be well. But I mean, do you really want this on every collection? Like every collection in the database, yeah, get all, just do it. 10 million log entries from 5 years ago, just get all. You know, okay, one approach people take is like, let's just expose this as iQueryable, right? And I feel like this is just like a punt, right? Like, I have no idea what you want, so just go do it yourself. Like, it's really not a solution more than just hand waving, right? You know, so let's get a little RXy and get like push notifications. And so now we have this observable, like, I don't even know how to pronounce this, right? But, you know, if we remember, right, like, originally we started this because
That's a thing.
that is a thing.
Out of RX,
Yeah, that's an RX thing, right? So we started this with the whole idea that, you know, all the smart people were gonna like design this thing and it was gonna be so easy for the juniors to consume. And now we've got this sort of thing with like multiple keys and key types and queue observe. I mean, it's just insane, right? So even trying to keep this simple, like, just doesn't work, right? So, you know, how can we address this? You know, one approach is to have like a specific repository. So we can say our customer repository implements iRepository, and then there we have a method like get high value customers. This is kind of a sidebar. Anytime I see like customer repository and then iCustomer repository or iFoo and foo, like I immediately think like that's like a code smell, right? Like, why do you just have foo and iFoo? Because it's already saying like there can only be one foo. Like, what are you going to call the second implementation? Foo 2? Like, so I never get that. I prefer like naming them specifically like Raven customer repository. So you know like, oh, another one could be like a Redis customer repository, I think. But yeah. So we have this specific repository, but you know, immediately somebody's going to say like, we need another abstraction here, right? So because we don't want to just put customer repository, and we need iCustomer repository. And then we'll have our customer repository like implement both of those. And then somebody's going to say like, oh, you know, what we should really do is like code-gen the iRepository version. So we'll put those in partial classes. So we'll have two class files, one that gets code-gen, and then we'll have another one that we actually write specifically. And then somebody says, no, what we really need is a base class where we can put all the common properties like ID and create it. So now, like, then we end up with all this sort of cruft that we build, but we started this to make things simpler for people who didn't understand what was going on, and now we have this thing. Like on the base class, I'm kind of wary of base classes, especially when they're just nothing but properties. If I was going to do it, I'd probably do interfaces. But the problem with this kind of a base class is I find it over time it becomes like a dumping ground. It's like 3 of the classes need this. Just shove it in the base class, and now you're kind of back in that throw not implemented situation again, where like, oh, you can't really use it if it's one of these because we didn't actually need it for that. But my other problem with this sort of approach is you end up with one of these guys. I pulled this off of Oren's blog. It's actually a little stunning how often I see this with customers.
That's a slow one.
Yeah, no. So I've seen this repeatedly, and what's even more stunning is like if you go into iCart service, which is, you know, the implementation is cart service, then it takes all of these things as dependencies as well, and then you have methods in each that are calling them. So in the controller, what he's doing is like calling to the cart service to figure out something, then he'll call the emailer service, and then he'll call back to the cart service, and then he'll call the address service, and it's just, it's a procedural nightmare, right? And you have the situation where you basically have circular dependencies, and it's just by pure happenstance that you just don't get in an endless loop, because anybody introducing new code has no idea that the code on the other side isn't calling right back into the same method, right? Like you'd have to go and explore all of these things to make sure you're not getting yourself in a bad state. And back to the testing thing, right? Like, so what's the idea here? Like, how am I going to test this? I'm going to mock out 9 things and have those like return expected values. Like, okay, and this is a unit test. It seems a lot more like an integration test to me, but yeah. So the idea here is that abstractions really don't scale, right? Like you just can't keep stacking them forever. You can't do turtles all the way down, right? Like Raven client is an abstraction over RavenDB, which is an abstraction over SN over Ron and Lucene for a while, which is an abstraction over files on disk, which is an abstraction over bytes, which I didn't even mention, Raven client is also abstracting HTTP for you, which is an abstraction over TCP. I mean, how many layers are we just going to keep stacking on before we just can't operate anymore, right? So there's a great blog post that Oren has, which is called Limit Your Abstractions. And it says, like, you get 6 to 12, right? And I found that really eye-opening because, you kind of look back at this code. It's like, well, I've already used 9, right? So I've got 3 left for my app. Uh-oh. Another great, I think it's a video, is Greg Young's 8 lines of code, which to me was really eye-opening. Kind of made me sort of go back and sort of rethink everything about how I approach software and actually understanding what I'm trying to accomplish. So what else can we do? Like, well, we wouldn't want to just like put Raven like right in our ASP.NET controller, right? Like that would be terrible, right? Well, I've been on a lot of projects where, we were someday going to have an API, and someday there was going to be a mobile client, and someday there was going to be a web client, and those days never really arrived. But we'll have all these abstractions just in case, right? It's funny that business people are almost more guilty of Yagni sometimes than developers. Like they have these grand dreams, but make sure we can do this, right? So here's some person abstracting to ensure the future, right? And then, after I watched the 8 lines of code, I kind of experimented with ASP.NET MVC and content negotiation, and you can actually get pretty far just using content negotiation to service those different needs without having like some massive abstraction layer. So it's not completely untenable just to do Raven right in your controller. But sometimes you have some shared things that you want to kind of put together. So another layer that you could go to is extension methods, right? So you want to do ordering. You want to take care of things that are not deleted with soft deletes. You want to filter for new things or public things or high-value customers. So extension methods are a reasonable way to do it. Query objects. So the basic idea here is that you're going to take a query and encapsulate it in a class. So in your controller, you can new this guy up, give him a session. I suppose you could find some way to get your container to do that, but okay. But like here, we're just like on the execute, a high-value customer is apparently a customer who has a purchase total of more than $100,000. Great. If that changes, I can come in here and change it without changing my controller. Great. So I'm abstracted, but I don't have some generic layer that I have to go through to take care of things. So for me, like, the purpose of architecture is to reduce the number of things that I need to worry about right now, right? Sort of a corollary to that is it will minimize the impact of an errant decision. If I make a mistake, I can recover, I feel like the whole idea that you're going to get, some smart guy in a room and then they're just going to go design the entire system up front and give a deadline, of course, right? Like, I'll tell you exactly the day that we're going to be done. No team involvement, just sitting by himself, it's just a failure mode, right? It doesn't work. And in order to try to achieve those goals by just adding layers of abstraction that don't actually add value is just going to make it worse. So my personal preference or go-to, I'll stipulate that I usually start everything, including projects or even class files, in the most naive way possible. I'll just, console app in main, just start coding, and then usually just kind of evolve the project as I go along. But one of my favorite sort of patterns that I found is using the mediator pattern. So I have a controller that takes a mediator, right? So there's one of my abstractions, right? That's one of my 6 to 12. So all controllers take one and only one dependency, which is this mediator. And then the mediator has a send method where I can send a request object and get a response. Okay? Done, right? So he can say, hey, basically he's saying, hey, I have this request data, I want a view model. Thanks. Now, I've kind of taken stuff out of here, but once you put in content negotiation, HTTP status codes, if you're going to do hypermedia and you want to build actual resources, not just throw your data over the wire, you're going to build hypermedia resources, the controller has plenty to do without actually figuring out how to talk to databases. Okay? So for the mediator, I'll set up, and here I just have an anonymous method, but it could be a method, a full-blown method. It could be a whole class that does this, whatever. That kind of does the coordination work, right? So he's going to resolve a document store, new up a view model, and then pass that to two bounded contexts, sales and shipping, right? So I actually did this for sort of an in-service bus / SOA demo. And the idea was that sales and shipping had their own databases, right? In this particular instance, they're on the same server, so there's one document store, but they're two different databases, right? Do I really want in the controller to have to understand that there's one database versus two databases, or one document store versus two? Not really. So I can have this coordination logic that sort of aligns things here, but that's all he does. He doesn't do any other logic. The nice thing here, I think at some point I evolved this to where there was an async version and I ran them together, but I just had to change this code. I didn't have to touch the controller. So then implementing that, the handle for sales, right, is now dead simple. He goes, talks to Raven, loads the customer, assigns a name, whatever, right? But the main point is, by the time I get here, I have every capability of Raven at my disposal, right? If I want to push sales to something else, we're going to run sales right on Voron. I can change this, and I have every capability that I have for Voron right here at my disposal, right? So I haven't abstracted away behind layers of fluff. I'm right on the metal where I need to be on the metal. But if I want, the controller can be free from all these concerns. It doesn't have to change. So they can be open close. If I look at the shipping side, same story, right? Also notice that he's got a shipping customer. The other one had a sales customer. They're in two separate databases. They're not related in any way, shape, or form. They are logically all part of a customer record, but that's a logical reference. There is no single V customer. But he grabs his version of customer. He can go set up this thing. I think I have city, state, zip as one field because it just gets dumped on the screen. If the view model gets changed so that those are three separate fields, I change the view model and I change this guy. But I know exactly how to optimize, right? I can optimize my query against the data store to get exactly the data I need. I don't have to pass things back through all these layers. One sort of thing that you get into with that iCustomer repository and iOrder repository, and once you need things from several of those, you have to get full hydrations of objects back through the layer, then get another full hydration of an order, get back through the layer, and then you pick off name. And it just really gets ridiculous. So to summarize, feel the pain first, right? Before you start abstracting, one, sort of understand what you're abstracting, but then wait until it's actually causing you a problem before you just start adding abstraction layers. The cure should cause less damage than the disease, right? I've seen, I've kind of gotten away from using containers just because I've seen them become entities unto themselves, to the point that when people were hiring, trying to find people to hire, their knowledge of the particular container was actually more important than their knowledge of C# because there were so many container tricks that you had to be pretty well versed in how that container did things in order to make any progress. It's actually pretty frightening. So the cure should be better than the disease. And then finally, sort of limit your abstractions, right? Stick to a few core concepts and ride them out. Don't give up your technology choice. If you've made it for a particular reason, leverage it to its full capabilities. Don't put it behind some generic fluff layer. So the slides for this are out on GitHub. I try to be pretty consistent about using my name over the web, so Twitter and GitHub and all that's just my name. And references to some of the stuff that I've talked about are there in these slides. And that's it. Questions?
I had a discussion similar to this with you. There still is a place for
Yeah. Oh, so you're doing DDD and you don't want it in your domain model? Well, I mean, Raven really should be sitting in your infrastructure, not in the domain anyway. So I wouldn't have the domain model sort of loading itself up, right? If it can just be loaded and then exist, then it really wouldn't have persistence concerns in it anyway, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more in terms of where all is being specific. This doesn't fit the model.
Yeah.
An aggregate is not,
Yeah, so one sort of pattern that I see is sort of the noun-based service abstraction, like customer and order and whatever, kind of leads to this sort of problem. Usually the way I approach things is starting with some sort of maybe task-based UI, then I have a command that comes in. That command can then delegate to methods which address cross-cutting concerns, right? It can load up several documents which then do whatever and then save them in a transaction, right? But I don't necessarily feel the need to have every noun sort of be the end-all and the be-all of what the system is going to do, because at the end of the day, I want to model a specific business feature, right? And customer isn't enough to handle that, right? So I want to handle customer has moved, which may cut across aggregate root boundaries, but I'm going to handle that command explicitly, right? Some of that might be one aggregate might start it off and fire an event, Like Maro's going to probably talk about events a little bit more. But he'll fire an event and the other aggregates can react off of that. But it's really situational, right? Like, I just don't think there's a way to sort of say up front, there's going to be one way for this application for all things, right? I saw a quote recently which I thought was pretty good, which was, the essence of tyranny is the denial of complexity. And I feel like in software, we're kind of guilty of that. Like, we want to understand how everything works. So let's like define the architecture up front, and then everybody just follows this pattern. But you just keep running into situations where, you know, this case doesn't quite fit the pattern. And at that point, you either have to admit that this one pattern isn't going to solve all your problems, or you can just say, look, I'm going to actually design each feature to be what it wants to be and have it operate in the best possible manner for that feature. Anybody else? Right. So, you know, basically anything could be okay, right? Like, that. Yeah. Yeah. Sure. I mean, you're going to have stuff that you do in your project that makes sense for your project, right? The kind of hilarious thing about the generic repository is supposed to be this end-all solution that every software project could just use without ever thinking about it. And that's what I really object to, is just there's a sort of idea that even in a project level, that this is the last time we're going to have to think about data access, right? It's just ridiculous. So anything may be applicable in a given situation. For instance, you know, one of the common patterns for Raven is to put the save changes in the infrastructure. I've used it, it works. It also can get some interesting things happening when, if you don't forget to like, don't save when you're doing gits and things are changing when you're not expecting it to. Usually what I do is just pull that back down to where I'm actually doing the data manipulation so I can explicitly call save changes. But, you know, in some cases, like, I want to save changes to get back an incrementing identity so that I can then apply that ID to something else. And it's just easier for me to choose to bring that into my code, so it's more complex, but I have more levers, but I can make that choice on a case-by-case basis.
Something will also doing that provide save the change. You don't go do that.
Right. Anybody else? Okay, cool. Enjoy lunch.